The other day, I posted a video of my new multi-ball Trident code, and people have asked a lot of interesting questions like how or just why. Um, but before I get into all that, I'd like to show you something that I forgot to put in the video the other day. I think it's important. So I'm booting the machine. This is the same machine, but I flipped the switch to boot to the old software. And what you'll see here is that even though I've upgraded, with the multi-ball trough and the auto plunge and all that stuff, the way I've done it, you can still play the old software. So I haven't, you know, changed anything on the machine that was really fundamental to the way it plays. It will still be compatible with original Trident, even though I've added some new hardware to it. So here's the new hardware. This is an auto plunger. I got it from Pinball Life. You see I had to cut away a little bit of the wood rail there so that the plunger would have enough room to move. And then I also had to take some bits of metal off of the little plunger guide there. I don't know what you call that. It used to have two little pieces of metal that hung down. Now the auto plunger will stop the ball there. You see the auto plunger comes also with its own trough switch, which is important so that we know when the ball's in the trough. Here's the actual trough. This is a 4-ball version. Pinball Life sells one that's up to 8 balls, but that seemed a little unnecessary. It comes with optical switches for the ball 1 and jam sensor, so I had to do that little board I just showed you to convert the optical to the switch matrix. And on my machine, that's just hanging there, but it should be mounted somewhere. I use these connectors I found in my shop to connect up to the little optical boards. That's Scorpion, by the way. So, I could have done 8 balls, but I would have had to find space on the switch matrix for the extra switches, and it didn't seem at all like a good idea for Trident to have 8 balls in it. So that solenoid for the plunger is on the same solenoid channel that it used to be. So that's why the old code still works to drive it. And Trident used all the solenoids, so I had to do the plunger, the auto plunger, as a continuous, but no big deal. I wired all the switches right into the switch matrix. So there was a bunch of empty space on the Trident switch matrix. I just used some of those empty slots for my new trough switches. And I'll show you all that in a second. So 3 major pieces of hardware added. You call it 3. There's 2 different kits from Pinball Life for the trough. There's one for the actual trough that goes below the playfield, and then there's a bunch of parts that they sell. I think it's $35 for like the over the playfield stuff, like guides and stuff like that. That's really helpful. And then the auto plunger is a separate kit. Altogether, I think it's about $200 for the plunger and the trough. Then you have to do a little circuit board, like I said, to convert the optical to the switch matrix. Run a couple wires, and that's about it. Here's my playfield with the right flipper removed. So to fit all this stuff in there, we're going to have to remove the right flipper and rotate it a little bit. It doesn't matter to the way the flipper operates. So I'm just going to swing it clockwise a little bit there. And that gives me enough room to cut out this slot. I used a oscillating multi-tool with a wood bit to cut a straight line, to cut these 2 straight lines to, make the slot for the new trough. So here's my trough mounted. Most of it exists below the playfield, which is why we had to do that big slot, as you can see. Then on the top, I cut out the slot a little bit deeper because I wanted to put this little ramp here for the ball, and this is to prevent rollbacks, so the ball doesn't bounce off that metal rail on the right and then roll back into the trough. I had to drill little relief holes for the screws for the flippers, for the right flipper, so that it would have enough room to fit. And then the new auto plunger fit pretty easily to the right of the trough there. I had to do a couple things. You have to cut away the wood rail so the plunger will have enough swing so that it can actually plunge the ball. And you have to cut a little relief channel in your shooter lane so that the troughs, so the new shooter lane switch will be able to, detect when the ball's ready in the shooter lane. There's also a piece of metal on the bottom of the playfield that I had to cut. Here's the top of the playfield again. You can see all the guides are mounted. And then here's all the parts that I removed during the course of this, and there's that chunk of wood saved for later in case I needed to, glue that back in place because I decided to undo this change. So one of the things that makes this conversion so easy is that Trident has such a wide open switch matrix. If you look on this diagram, you'll see that switches 34 through 40 are wide open. And 33 was the out hole. That makes it even easier. So the way the switches work on these solid state games is switch 1 through 8 would be on strobe 0, switch 9 through 16 would be on strobe 1, and therefore if you continue that through, switch 33 through 40 are on strobe 4. So all of our switches are going to be on the same strobe line, and we're just going to pull that from the out hole strobe. Looking at this, you'll see the switch on the left, the ball switch on the left. You can actually see the red and yellow wire that used to go to the out hole switch, and that's the strobe. That's strobe 4. The return for this one is on that brown wire there, and that's the switch 33 return, which is going to be the same as the switch 25 return and the same as the switch 17 return. So that's how the returns work. After the diode, those are all just chained together. Here are my new assignments. You've got the out hole, which is ball 4, still on 33. That's why the old code still works. Ball 3 I put on 34, ball 2 I put on 35, ball 1 on 36. The jam, which is above ball 1, so if the balls happen to be stacked, I put on 37. And then the new shooter lane switch is on 38. Because those were open before, the old code is going to ignore them, and my new code can look at those new switch assignments to do the multi-ball play. Once I've changed my strobe to all these new switches, the leading edge of all these new switches, then we have to chain the returns back so that the code can read them. I mentioned before that you can just subtract 8 or 16 from one of these switch numbers and you'll see where you could return to a different switch. I chose switches that were already physically pretty close to what I was going to use. So you see there, ball 3, I've chained it down to the right return lane. It's very close, which means there's a wire now going from the post diode side of the ball 3 switch to the right return lane. Here's that picture I showed you before. The ball 3 switch there in the middle has a red wire coming off after the diode, and that red wire goes to the right return lane switch after that diode, so that when the strobe comes through this ball 3 switch, it's going to be read back through that red wire back to the right return lane switch. That means we're going to have 5 wires we have to run after the diode on these 5 switches, then back to switches that already exist on the playfield. And again, here's my diagram of how I ran those wires. Now for the jam and the shooter lane, it's not just as easy as hooking up after the diode, because those are optical switches on the ball trough. So the first thing we need to do is convert that optical signal to something that the Stern MPU can read on the regular switch matrix. Here's the circuit I came up with to convert the optical signals from the new trough to signals that could be read by the switch matrix of the original machine. So the strobe comes in here. Oh, before I start, the way this generally works is the transmitter is always blasting out light towards these receivers. And if the receiver sees them, then they act like transistors that are biased by that light. So if there's no ball in the way, you basically have a clean path here from the strobe to ground, which is going to eat the strobe, so it's not going to show up on these return lines. And then if there is a ball blocking, then it will block this so that your strobe will basically get right to the return lines, which means that the switches will look closed if there's a ball there and will look open if there's no ball there, which is operating kind of the way you think it would. So the first thing I have to do is isolate the strobe from the rest of the switches with these 6.7K resistors. If I didn't do this, then the effects of these sensors would, show up on the switch matrix. It would mess up the rest of the switch matrix. So the strobes go through 6.7K resistors, then into the receiver. Like I said, if the receiver is biased by this light, then it gets grounded out through these 1Ks back to the ground. If there's a ball in the way, then the strobe lives and it goes through this diode and goes back on the return lines. And these diodes are to make it so that other returns switches don't, look like they're coming from this switch. And then the entire assembly needs +5 and ground just to operate the receiver and the transmitter side both. Well, I guess just the transmitter side. And then they plug in with these connectors on either side of the ball trough. For those connectors, they look like they're 4mm pitch male connectors on the boards. I guess, you could look for like a Molex friction fit 4mm pitch connector, maybe with crimp ends. What I did was I just found those similar connectors on an old power supply that I didn't need anymore, and I cut those connectors off and used them. I'll try to spec those out, but speccing out connectors is not my forte. So if anybody else comes up with the right connectors to use for those ball troughs, that would be a welcome addition. So this circuit is super easy to build by hand, or somebody could turn it into a PCB pretty easily. The key part is having wires, I guess, long enough that you could mount the whole thing to the playfield somewhere to get it out of the way. You'll need to run +5 and ground back from the back box of the machine. I just clamped them onto the +5 and ground from the MPU, but they could be pulled off of any one of the connectors in the back box that has +5 and ground. The strobe, I daisy chained off of the original strobe coming from the ball trough, so no need to run a wire back to the back box for that. The return lines for I4 and I5 to get those sensors back to the switch matrix. For ball 1, you run it to the top left slingshot, and for the jam sensor, you run it to the bottom right slingshot. So you just run a wire after the diode on that little circuit board you just made over to the top left slingshot after the diode there. And then the same thing for jam. You run a wire after the diode there to the bottom right slingshot after the diode, and that will tie everything back into the original switch matrix. To recap, for the switches, what we did was we pulled the original strobe line, which is the red and yellow wire here, from the original ball trough switch. We daisy chained that on the leading edge of the diode, and that's the yellow wires you see in this picture. I just daisy chained it to the leading edge of the diode on all these switches. Then after the diode, I've got the brown wire, which was the original ball trough return, and the rest of the wires you see here, there's a red one and a yellow one and a light blue one and a black one. I used different colors, and then I just ran them around to the nearest physical switches that had the same return lines that I needed, and that's this diagram here. Here's what the head looks like when we're all done. This wire, the blue one that you see on that connector on the solenoid driver board, is the one that goes to the auto plunger. That's the one new line you'll have to run for the solenoid. And then you'll also see clipped in to the +5 and the ground. So there you can see I've got a black wire clipped into ground and a little red wire clipped into +5, and that goes to power my transmitter for the optical sensors. So I've run 3 wires up to the head, that's it. The blue one goes into the solenoid driver board. That comes from the auto plunger for the shooter lane, and then the black and the red go down to the new circuit board that we created for the transmitter and receiver of the optical sensors. One last tour of the underside of the playfield, and you'll see that the blue wire that I just mentioned goes to the auto plunger on the right. The power for that solenoid can just be daisy chained off of any other solenoid power. They're all common on this machine. And then you'll see a bunch of wires from the sensors that go, from the new trough switches that go around to the various playfield elements. You can see my light blue wire, my yellow wire there, if you're looking carefully. So that's a lot of information. Probably not the best way to convey it. I'll do step-by-step details at some point and post them probably on Pinside. If you look up Trident 2020 or 2021. I think it's Trident 2020 on pin side. I'm going to post this in that thread because it's really just an extension of Trident 2020. I'm calling it Trident 2022, whatever. If anybody tries this out, tries to follow my footsteps, that'd be awesome. You can just reach out with any questions that you have along the way, and I'll try to answer them the best I can. It's a lot more detail than I thought would be in this. It really seemed a lot easier to do as I was doing it than when I'm trying to explain it here. It seems impossible to cover everything, but it's not that big a deal. I mean, it's just a few new things. The biggest part of it was, tying into the original switch matrix and then tying in that solenoid for the auto plunger. But really, it's not a whole lot of moving parts. Anyway, hope you give it a try. Hope you liked it, and let me know. Talk to you.